So this is my first time reading for the Buzzard, and I am working on a new novel that is loosely based on my grandmother and her identical twin. Both are long gone now. So just to give you the basis of the novel, there used to be a superstition. There's a superstition to a rare occurrence that happens when babies are born with the thin membrane over their face. It's called a caul. And these are known as veiled births, and there's superstition that this is a special baby. They're just destined to do something great. And so my grandmother was born with this caul, or veiled birth, and her identical twin wasn't. So my great-grandmother believed in that superstition, and all their lives, to them and their siblings, she always would say, "She's a special one. She was born with a veil over her face." So if you can imagine what this did to her identical twin, not being born with one, and the jealousy and anger that it created all their lives. So this is loosely based on that. And the twins in the story, they're named Geraldine and Josephine. And this scene that I wrote, this is where the two twins, they have a spelling bee today, and Geraldine and Josephine are practicing for it, and you'll see a bit of this rivalry. This is about when they're 12 years old. So, okay. Geraldine practiced all morning for the 7th grade spelling bee. Standing in the middle of the living room, Josephine waved a pencil in the air like a conductor as she read off random words that they studied all year. Geraldine told her sister she was picking the wrong words. "Do you want to win or not?" Josephine asked. Geraldine sighed, concentrating on each letter with a pause in between, waiting for Josephine to nod in agreement and anticipating a frown when she got it wrong. Mama watched them from the couch, folding laundry on the cushion. "Jerry, you've had enough," she said, not looking up. "Switch turns with Joe." Geraldine wanted to protest, but a hard glance from Mama stopped her. "Yes, ma'am," Geraldine said, looking down at her feet. Josephine handed her sister the white flashcards and rattled off the words that Jerry called out, quick and succinct. Mama stopped folding the laundry to listen, nodding along with Joe. Jerry flipped through the cards faster, not giving Joe time to finish the words, but Joe kept up flawlessly. "Good job, Joe," Mama interrupted her on the word amendment. "Put your coats on. You don't want to be late." She went back to folding the clothes. Geraldine stood in place watching Mama as if she were waiting for something. Josephine handed her sister her coat and lunch bag, then pushed her out the door. As they descended the porch steps, Joe went to grab her sister's hand, and Jerry snatched it back. "Mama says we have to hold hands, Jerry." "I don't need your hands to cross the street. We're not babies, Joe." Jerry walked past Joe with her head held high, leaving Joe on the stairs, not caring if she caught up. Joe ran after her sister to walk by her side, wondering what set Jerry off. Miss Jameson watched them next door, knitting on her porch swing. She was always spying on the Johnsons, giving detailed reports to Mama about who came by and knocked on the house, what strange face she didn't recognize leaving their home, and if Jerry and Joe were hanging around the wrong boys in the neighborhood. Mama often commented to the girls about how she wished Miss Jameson would mind her business. Jerry wondered why Mama didn't just tell her off, as she was very capable of doing with relatives who dipped their noses into her life. But Mama secretly enjoyed Miss Jameson's reports. With no family close by and her ex-husband away with his new wife miles away, Mama was glad to know someone was looking after her girls. Miss Jameson was ready to catch the Johnson twins up to no good, especially Geraldine. She was not blind to Jerry's secretive nature. She just knew it was that insolent girl who poisoned her schnauzer, Franklin. When Mama wasn't looking, Jerry and Joe liked to climb Miss Jameson's fence to eat her apples, which the old woman sold to neighbors. One hot Texas summer day, Miss Jameson was away and Franklin backed the girls into a corner, growling with sharp yellow teeth. Jerry hopped over the fence to their yard, but Joe slipped and fell back, scraping her knees against the rotten wood. She braced herself and flung a hand out towards Franklin, who bit her finger. Joe screamed and ran towards the front of the house. A neighbor across the street heard the commotion, and the girls denied anything happened when Miss Jameson later accused them of trespassing. The next morning, she found Franklin motionless on the back porch. To her friends, Miss Jamison referred to Jerry as Satan's cunning worker. Something didn't mix well in the womb. The Johnson twins may have been identical, but Miss Jamison never confused them. It was their eyes that gave them away. Joe's were alert, intuitive, and kind. Jerry's were vain and deceitful. As the girls passed Miss Jamison's house, Jerry smiled back at the old woman, who sneered under her breath. "We can practice some more if you like," Joe said, gauging her sister's annoyance as they walked the dirt road to school. Whenever her sister fell into one of her moods, Joe was extra sensitive and looked for a clue that would make Jerry happy. "No, thank you," Jerry said, clutching her lunch bag tighter against her thigh. They were silent most of the way. Joe darted her eyes at Jerry every once in a while, which annoyed Jerry. She grabbed Joe's hand. She couldn't stay upset at her sister for too long. Joe was always there to defend her. She hated and loved her for it, because that was supposed to be her role as the oldest sister. Joe made her look weak. The girls approached the one-story rural schoolhouse as other black children rolled inside. It sat about 100 feet from the road. Jerry and Joe sat in the front of the girls' section. The boys sat on the right section on the side of the room. Jerry pulled out the flashcards from her dress pocket and silently mouthed the words to herself, twisting a thick braid around her finger. Their teacher, Mrs. Stacy, wearing a long black shirt and buttoned blouse, stood at the front of the chalkboard, taking head count as the rest of the students took their seats. Many of the children had known Mrs. Stacy since primary school, because she was also their Sunday school teacher at First United Methodist Church. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Stacy said in a deep, stern voice. She reminded Joe of Mama. She was tall and strong-willed. Mrs. Stacy spoke like proper white folks. While many blacks were migrating north for jobs, Mrs. Stacy left her home in New York to her husband's Texas birthplace to help care for his sick mother. When she died, Mrs. Stacy wanted to return home, but her husband said it was better to stay with family. He didn't know anyone in New York, and in Texas, he understood his role better. Jerry was antsy for the contest to begin and couldn't stop swinging her legs under the desk like a child eager for Christmas morning. Mrs. Stacy alternated the spelling bee between the boys and the girls, each one taking turns at the front of the class, their timid voices sounding out the words. One by one, they were eliminated as the words became longer and convoluted to their young ears. It was down to Jerry, Joe, and Bertha. "No fair, the girls always win," a voice said from the back of the room. "Hush up," said Miss Stacy said, as the other students giggled. She pointed to Bertha. "Spell consequently." Bertha was a shy girl who never looked you in the eyes. She had a terrible stutter, and the twins were both amazed she even made it this far. She took long pauses to consider the syllables, faltering in the third, and consequently. Mrs. Stacy told her to take her seat. Joe was next. "Miscellaneous," Joe said. "Miscellaneous. She practically yelled that last letter. Jerry wanted to roll her eyes. Joe was a big show-off, and being smart wasn't good enough. She had to flaunt it any chance she got, whether it was showing up poor Bertha or proving to Mama that she was the better daughter. Jerry stood tall and straight when Mrs. Stacy called upon her. "Acquaintance," Mrs. Stacy said impatiently. Damn, that was the next word on the list before Mama made her switch with Joe. Jerry's palms were sweaty as she tried to envision the words, sounding out the letters. Mrs. Stacy was eager to end the contest. Many mistook her to be tender-hearted towards children, having spent so much time around them, but they made her nervous and weary. They were a constant reminder of her cage. She saw their cotton-picking mill worker parents in their faces. Jerry began to feel at ease as she was halfway through the word. A-C-Q-U-A-I. Jerry, sit down, Mrs. Stacy said. The twins gave each other confused looks and stared perplexed at their teacher. Jerry stumbled over the letters, but she hadn't made a mistake, and they were sure of it. Sit down, Jerry. A deep pain settled at the back of Jerry's throat as she threw herself into her chair. Joe looked at her sister sulking, and the rest of the students who had grown bored, drawing on their desks, passing notes, and whispering to each other. Normally, Mrs. Stacy wouldn't put up with such rudeness. Acquaintance, the teacher said. But Mrs. Stacy, Joe started, Jerry wasn't finished. And I say she is. Acquaintance. Joe shook her head no. Are you going to deliberately waste all of these children's time and mine? No, ma'am. Jo felt like crying, but she would not let her classmates see her tear up in front of Mrs. Stacy. She hoped against hope that her teacher was teasing, though Mrs. Stacy was far from the joking type. Fine, you're just as stubborn as your mother. Jerry could have slapped Mrs. Stacy, but she was even more embarrassed by Jo's behavior. Why couldn't she just spell the word instead of making them look bad? Well, class, it looks like Jo doesn't want to play anymore. We'll have to save the prize for another day. Hopefully it will go to a more grateful child. Those last words were like a slap in the face, and Jo slowly took her seat next to her sister. Jerry refused to meet her eyes. What did she expect showing off all morning? Rejected by her first childhood idol, Jo replayed the events in her mind, trying to find some excuse for her teacher's dismissive behavior, as most of us do when it's too painful to see our gods as humans.